This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, your host here on Last Week in the Church, the show where we sift through the last 7 days of latest and greatest on the Vatican beat. We've actually been on vacation for a fortnight, so this is more like the last 3 weeks in the church, but not so, really, because just in the last 7 days, as ever in the Pope Francis era, there has been a galactic harvest of news in and around the Vatican. So here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with a slapdown of schism. The Vatican summons Italian Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò, Pope Francis's most acerbic and, I think most would say, probably most extreme critic, on charges of schism. Viganò chooses not to show up for the convocation. We will discuss where that leaves us and what to make of all of this. Second, bye-bye in Burgos. 10 Poor Clare nuns are declared excommunicate in the Spanish Diocese of Burgos for their affiliation with a rebel priest and also for alleged misappropriation of church property. We'll try to unpack what that story is about. Third, this week, we've got removing Rupnik. The Vatican's communications chief, in an address in the United States, defends the decision not to remove artwork by accused sexual abuser Father Marco Rupnik from the website of the Vatican department that he heads. We'll explain what he said and how Rupnik's alleged victims are responding to it all. Fourth up this week, we have church and state, specifically in Italy, where a 93-year-old cardinal has revealed a previously unknown episode regarding the efforts by some Italian politicians to get the Catholic Church to help bring down an Italian government. We'll explain what was revealed and why it might have echoes in the here and now. Next up this week, we have going Gänswein. It's official. Pope Francis has appointed German Archbishop Georg Gänswein, the former private secretary to Pope Benedict XVI, as the new papal envoy in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic states. We've talked about this before, but we'll explain why it's important. And finally this week, we have once more into the breach. Once more, the Vatican is getting set to engage in a mammoth real estate deal. We'll ask the question whether there's any reason to believe that this one is going to end up any happier than the last time the Vatican did this, which ended, of course, in mammoth disaster, chaos, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. All of that is on the docket this week, so please stay where you are because I will be right back. All right, everybody, thank you for being with us. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, June 25th, in the year of our Lord 2024. As I mentioned at the top of the show, my wife Elise and I were off the last couple of weeks. We were in the small Italian hamlet of Nettuno, which is Italian for Neptune, the god of the sea. And of course, this is a seaside Italian town about an hour and a half south of Rome. We had a beautiful time on the beach and watching baseball wherever you have been for the last fortnight. I hope it has been a blessed and rewarding time. And baby, we are back. So let's start with the big news of the last week on the Vatican beat, which is Italian Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò, former secretary, that is the #2 official, of the government of the Vatican City State, and former papal nuncio, that is ambassador in the United States, whose claim to fame now is that he is the most outspoken and, frankly, perhaps the most enigmatic critic of Pope Francis. He has been formally charged with schism by the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. That was revealed this past week that on June 11th, a letter was sent to Viganò summoning him to come to the offices of the Dicastery on June 20th to defend himself against charges of schism or to designate a lawyer to do so on his behalf. Viganò did not show up. He now has a few more days, and no one expects that he's going to do anything more than he has already done, at which point, presumably, this finding of the charge of schism will become official and some sort of ecclesiastical sanction will be imposed. Now, when I say it was revealed, let me be clear. I don't mean that a news agency broke this story or that the Vatican announced it. I mean that Viganò himself went on social media to publish the letter he had been sent and to declare that he found the charge of schism from Pope Francis to be an honor. He compared himself to the late Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who founded the Breakaway Society of St. Pius X in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. In other words, if you're asking, did Viganò show any kind of remorse, any sense of, I don't know, shame, regret, guilt, culpability, anything? The answer would be absolutely not. On the contrary, he basically doubled down. Now, from a certain point of view, I suppose what you could say about all of this is, really? Like what took so long, right? I mean, it has been clear for some time that Viganò is not exactly a big Pope Francis fan. I mean, if you were going to charge this guy with schism, you probably could have done this 5 years ago. Now, many news reports suggest that what has changed in the meantime is that Viganò reportedly has had himself reconsecrated as a Catholic bishop by a traditionalist prelate who was associated with the Society of St. Pius X. In other words, he has formally identified himself with a breakaway or schismatic movement, and that perhaps has changed the calculus. But really, I mean, the basic idea that this is a guy who was broken with the teaching authority of Pope Francis, this is hardly new. Viganò's first outing in this regard came in 2018 when he published a lengthy letter accusing Pope Francis of a cover-up with regard to sexual abuse charges against ex-cardinal and ex-priest Theodore McCarrick in the United States, and suggested that because of that, Pope Francis ought to resign. And from that point forward, Viganò has progressively become the champion of pretty much every far-right traditionalist Mad Hatter conspiracy theory about the Pope and the Catholic Church that one can imagine. That is, he became a champion of skepticism about the coronavirus, opposition to, the press to get vaccinated, big skeptic about global warming and climate change, kind of an apologist for Vladimir Putin in Russia, somebody who talks a lot about the growth of a kind of a deep state, one world, secularist, Masonic, anti-Christian government, regime, whatever. I mean, in other words, we're talking about kind of the tinfoil brigade in a cassock is kind of where Viganò is coming from. Now, therefore, in itself, the fact he's been charged with schism probably is not the most astonishing development in human history. But two things about it are perhaps noteworthy. One is the way in which, especially here in Italy, mainstream conservatives, who you might think would either be silent or, maybe a little bit critical of all this, have instead actually been quite outspoken in complimenting Pope Francis and the Vatican for going after Viganò. This, I think, is because in some ways Viganò, for the last 6 years, has been Pope Francis's best friend. Because the easiest thing in the world to do for apologists for the Pope to discredit any mainstream conservative criticism is to say, that's just another Viganò. That's somebody who is like part of the Viganò crowd. And so Viganò has sort of become a self-parodying repository for any possible criticism of this Pope, and a very convenient rhetorical way for apologists for the Pope to discredit it. And so I think many conservatives are actually delighted to see the Vatican taking action, because now any conservative who is accused of being part of the Viganò brigade can say, Viganò was charged with schism. I haven't been. There's a clear dividing line between the two worlds, which perhaps many mainstream conservatives will welcome. The other interesting thing is the way in which the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, reacted to this news about Viganò, because basically what he said is, look, I knew Viganò when he worked at the government of the city-state. I knew Viganò when he was the nuncio in the United States. he was a serious guy. He actually did a reasonably good job. It's a total mystery to me what's happened to him in the meantime. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable reaction, but here's what's interesting about it. Back in 2018, when Viganò first spoke out against Pope Francis, a number of American bishops were asked by reporters for reactions to the charge that the Pope had been engaged in a cover-up on McCarrick. And a good number of them said something like, well, every accusation should be taken seriously. Now, ever since, those bishops have been accused of giving aid and comfort to the enemy, of being, sympathetic to this guy who was gone on to go off the deep end, right? Now, the thing is, what Paroline reminds us is that the reputation of Carlo Maria Viganò in 2018, when he first came forward, and his reputation today, are two very different things. And it's entirely possible that those American bishops back in 2018 did not intend to endorse the whole package that Viganò has become. Maybe they were simply saying accusations should be taken seriously, that we can't afford to write anything off. And that, in fact, perhaps those statements were not quite as borderline schismatic or anti-Francis as subsequent mythology from the Pope Francis echo chamber has sometimes made it sound. All right, second up this week, we've got bye-bye in Burgos. So another bit of breaking news, 10 Poor Clare nuns in a convent whose total population is 16, but 6 of these nuns were judged to be sufficiently elderly that they're vulnerable and therefore not perhaps responsible. The other 10 have been declared excommunicate by the Catholic Church on the grounds that they have affiliated themselves with a schismatic traditionalist Catholic priest in Spain who has himself previously been declared excommunicate, and further, that these nuns were attempting to buy another convent using funds that, belong to the Poor Clare order and ultimately to the Catholic Church, and that this was deemed to be unacceptable. And so they have essentially been given their marching orders. Now, in itself, the fact that 10 sisters in Spain have been declared excommunicate because they are part of this kind of traditionalist underground that is unhappy with post-Vatican II developments in Catholicism, and specifically with more recent developments under Pope Francis, that probably is not that big a deal. We have seen this kind of thing before, and unfortunately, in the life of the Catholic Church, there's always going to be some people who are unhappy, and some small number of them are going to take steps that are tantamount to formally separating themselves from communion with the Church. What is perhaps most interesting here is that these sisters had been fans of this rebel traditionalist priest for quite some time. That didn't exactly get them into formal hot water. What did is this plan to use their cash to buy another facility. In other words, perhaps the takeaway here is that if you want to stay out of trouble in the Catholic Church, for sure, try to avoid saying public things about how the Pope is a heretic or whatever. But even more than that, keep your eye on your bank account, because, you can say a lot of stuff and the system won't necessarily come down on you like a ton of bricks. You start frittering away the church's dollars and cents, on the other hand, and, you may find yourself pretty quickly in hot water. All right, third up this week, removing Rupnik. So, Italian layman Paolo Ruffini, veteran Italian journalist and pundit, who currently serves as the prefect for the Vatican's Dicastery for Communications. It's the agency that oversees the Vatican's communications operations. Ruffini was in the United States this past week to speak at a Catholic media convention, and he faced questions about why the website of the Dicastery for Communications continues to feature certain images of artwork produced by Father Marco Rupnik. This is the former Jesuit Slovenian priest and one of the most celebrated Catholic artists of the contemporary period, known particularly for his works that blend elements of Eastern and Western spirituality, but who was also been accused of the sexual abuse of adult women stretching over more than 20 years, most of them nuns associated with a community of sisters for whom he was the ecclesiastical sponsor in Slovenia and also in Rome. The question is, why hasn't the Dicastery for Communications removed these images from their website out of sensitivity for the feelings of Rupnik's alleged victims? And Ruffini basically was unrepentant. He essentially said, number one, look, these charges against Rupnik don't involve the sexual abuse of minors. They involve adults, so it's different than the abuse of minors. Secondly, he took a kind of who am I to judge stance, saying it's not up to me to adjudicate the charges against Rupnik. There are other people in the church who were looking into these things. And third, he said it is a mistake to believe that by taking down his artwork, that somehow means that I or anybody else would be closer to victims. That is an assumption that just doesn't pass the smell test, in his view. So basically, rather than the sort of politic, oh, thank you for bringing this to my attention, I'm going to go home and talk to people about it and we will see, which is what, somebody with a diplomatic bone in their body might have said. Instead, Ruffini essentially got his Irish up, even though I don't think he has a drop of Irish blood in his system. He's Italian, but nevertheless, got his back up, we can say, and basically refused to concede any ground. Now, this, of course, is part of a much larger debate because Rupnik's artwork is featured in a number of venues, very prominent venues in the Catholic world. It's in the Redemptoris Mater Chapel here in the Vatican. It's in the National Shrine in Washington, the headquarters of the Knights of Columbus. It's in Lourdes and Fatima and all over the place. And every one of these venues is currently having to have a conversation about whether to remove these images, and if so, logistically how to go about it, because in some cases it's very expensive and complicated. Now, on the other hand, taking these images off a website would not involve the outlay of millions of euro and decades of reconstruction. It would be a fairly simple procedure, particularly for a department that, runs websites for a living. I mean, this is kind of what the Dicastery for Communications does. Remains to be seen what will happen when Ruffini gets back home and has a chance to reflect on this. But in any event, the short-term takeaway is that in this one instance, you have a Vatican official basically saying, "Niet, not going to do it. No sale, no sir, no how." We'll see whether that holds up over the long run. All right, next up this week, church-state dynamics in Italy. 93-year-old Cardinal Camillo Ruini, the former vicar of Rome and president of the Italian bishops during the St. John Paul II years, revealed this week in an interview with Corriere della Sera, kind of the newspaper of record here in Italy, that in 1994, the then president of Italy, Oscar Luigi Scalfaro, had asked Ruini, along with Cardinal Angelo Sodano, who was the Vatican Secretary of State, and then Archbishop Jean-Louis Tauran, then the Vatican's foreign minister, for their help in bringing down the conservative government of the then Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi on the grounds that Berlusconi represented a threat to democracy. Ruini recounted that he, Sodano, and Tauran greeted this request with a kind of embarrassed silence, gave no response in that moment, and then promptly forgot about it. Ruini said that, look, there are threats to democracy, but he didn't think that Berlusconi was one of them. He said Berlusconi, who we all know was a kind of flamboyant, Trump-esque character. He was sort of Trump before Trump, if we can put it that way. He said, Berlusconi had his strengths and his weaknesses, but in any event, he'd been democratically elected, and that was kind of that. Now, the significance of this is, number one, it lifts the curtain on what everybody has always known, which is the relationship between throne and altar, church and state in Italy is incredibly tight, and that politicians are forever looking to ecclesiastical authorities to try to advance their own political agenda. But secondly, it also raises the question of whether this could happen again. Scalfaro was a center-left president with a conservative prime minister. The same thing is true today. We have a center-left president with Sergio Mattarella. We have a conservative prime minister with Giorgia Meloni. Many people then, as now, regard Meloni as a kind of threat to democracy because of her roots in neo-fascist political movements. Also, for a couple of constitutional reforms she is currently trying to push through. And once again, we have a very powerful president of the Italian Bishops' Conference in the form of Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Bologna. The big difference is that in the John Paul years, Ruini was a conservative and basically friendly to Berlusconi. Today, Zuppi is a progressive, basically hostile to the Meloni government. And so, if a similar request were to come down the pike today, it is entirely possible that things might actually play out a little bit differently. I have no way of knowing if those conversations are going on behind closed doors right now. What we do know on the back of the Ruini interview is that if they are going on, it would hardly be the first time. All right, next up this week, we've got Going Gänswein. We have talked on this show before about widely reported rumors that Pope Francis was going to ship off German Archbishop Georg Gänswein, the former private secretary to Pope Benedict XVI, as his new envoy to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, that is the Baltic states. This after he basically fired Gänswein as head of the papal household, left him twisting in the wind for several months, and then ordered him to go back to Germany without any kind of gig whatsoever. All of this perceived as a punishment for critical statements that Gänswein had made around the death of Pope Benedict XVI, revealing tensions between Benedict and Francis over issues such as the traditional Latin Mass and other matters, basically suggesting that Benedict had not agreed with certain steps that Pope Francis has taken. And this was perceived as stoking a division in the church between what might be called Benedict Catholics and Francis Catholics. Now, the issue going forward is how effective can Gänswein be as the papal envoy in the Baltics, given that typically an ambassador's effectiveness is directly related to how much juice they are perceived to have with the administration they represent. That is, if the president sends his best friend as the ambassador to a country, that country feels like this is a serious appointment. If the president sends his worst enemy to a country, then it's perceived as an insult, that he's using that country basically as a garbage dump or a parking spot, a way to get rid of somebody. Is that how the Baltics are going to receive this appointment? And will Gänswein be able to accomplish very much as the papal envoy there, given the perception that Pope Francis is not exactly going to drop whatever he's doing if the phone rings with Gänswein on the other end saying he needs something? So, we are going to have to see how this plays out. Now, so far, Gänswein himself has not said anything publicly about this appointment. He is a very suave and generally very diplomatic figure, and so, one imagines he's not going to say anything publicly. Privately, however, whether he is doing cartwheels over this appointment or packing his bags with reluctance, we don't yet know that. But this is an interesting experiment in what really makes the difference when it comes to an ambassadorial appointment. Is it that the ambassador is a celebrity, somebody with a high public profile, and therefore, whose pronouncements will be listened to and taken seriously? Because if that is the case, Gänswein is already a home run. Let me ask you this. How many papal ambassadors around the world can you name right now without using Google? I would expect it's a fairly short list. But Gänswein certainly is on it. He is probably already, right now, the best-known papal nuncio in the world. That's the test of effectiveness he's already passed. On the other hand, if the real test is having the support, the esteem, the trust, and the confidence of the head of state that you represent, then in that case, well, the picture is very different. We're going to have to see how all this plays out. All right, finally this week, we have once more into the breach. So, the last time the Vatican got involved in a multi-million-dollar real estate deal, to be quite honest, it didn't work out all that well. You may remember that it ended in what we have referred to on this program as the trial of the century. That is, the indictment of 10 different individuals, including for the very first time a cardinal of the Catholic Church, Italian Cardinal Angelo Becciu, former papal chief of staff and former prefect of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, for various forms of fraud, embezzlement, graft, misappropriation, what have you. 9 of those individuals were eventually convicted, including Becciu, after a trial that proved to be highly controversial and in some ways deeply embarrassing for the Vatican. Now, you might have thought that that would have induced some caution about entering into massive real estate deals that, could end up blowing up in your face. But in fact, it has been announced, was actually announced in February, that the Vatican is entering into another big-time real estate deal. This one to buy a former public hospital here in the city of Rome, the Hospital Forlanini, which was opened in the late 1920s and early 1930s. It was, at the time, the world's first healthcare facility exclusively devoted to the treatment of tuberculosis. It then evolved into a general-purpose hospital. It ended up being a sprawling 70-acre facility basically it was a small town in and of itself, and was one of the most prominent and widely used healthcare facilities here in town until in 2015, amid general disrepair and ballooning deficits, it was announced that Forlanini was closing. Now, at the time, this was said to be only temporary. The plan was that the region of Lazio, which is the region that includes the city of Rome, was going to make investments, rehab the hospital, bring it back up to code, and reopen it, give it back to the people of Rome, as a public trust. Now that, as I say, was almost a decade ago in 2015. In the meantime, various plans to do the necessary upgrades have come and gone. None of them have ever been realized, in the great tradition of Italian politics of announcing ambitious public works, but never actually following through on them. And so, instead, it was announced in February that a deal has been reached with the Vatican for the Vatican to buy at least some of the property, some of this 70-acre property. And puzzlingly enough, the Italian version of workman's comp, that is, its workplace insurance program, is going to pay to build a new facility on that land that the Vatican is buying, and then they're going to lease that facility to the Vatican as the new headquarters of Bambino Gesù, that is the papally sponsored pediatric hospital. No further details about this deal were released, but this week we got new reports from an Italian news agency called Roma Today suggesting that the dollar value of the deal is about $70 million. That is, the Vatican is paying $70 million to use the old Forlanini campus. And this has raised some hackles because the estimated total value of this facility is somewhere between 400 and 600 million euro. So the idea that the Vatican is getting a 600 million euro for a 70 million outlay has generated no small amount of criticism. There is a citizens group that is insisting that this is public property. It should not be deeded over to the Vatican as extraterritorial property in a kind of sweetheart deal. Remains to be seen if eventually anybody is going to go to jail over this, but it is safe to say that this transaction is already controversial. Obviously, at Crux, we will continue to have our eye on how this unfolds. All right, that is our show for this week. You can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site. We will be back here and in this same space and at this same time. Same bat time, same bat channel, 7 days hence. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you again very, very soon.